to the legends of the creative and entertainment industry. We talk to those on the rise. Lance Steen Anthony Nielsen asks about the highs, the lows, and everything in between. This is Outcast Creative, and this is Industry Interviews.
He is a warrior in a wasteland without mercy.
It's the little guy.
He has survived where countless others have died.
Good shot, huh?
He has destroyed all that would kill him.
Out of control.
He is the only one who can face the challenges of the Dungeon Master.
In a future that grows ever closer, the fate of our Earth will lie in the hands of one man, a solitary warrior of great courage. His name is Dojin, and he is called the Finder. His enemies will emerge from the underworld to test his strength. Urok, the Cyclopean warlord of the One Eyes. The assassin Baal. Half man, half machine. And Jared Sin, leader and mastermind of the sinister renegades. They will utilize their cruelest weapons. They will exploit their most mysterious powers.
And I'm going to jump in there, even though I could quite happily have watched the rest of that trailer. Who would have thought, when I was a kid, watching Metalstorm, the destruction of Jared Sin at the Isha Odeon in Screen 1, sometime I think in 1982, that one day I would be interviewing the star of that movie. Well, I am, and today I've got Jeffrey Byron in the house. This is fantastic for me. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm glad
it is my sincere pleasure. Thank you for having me, Lenz.
So before we start, I've got a message for you from your co-star of Metalstorm, Tim Thomason, who's become a good friend of mine and has been on the channel before and done an interview. And I followed his career since he was very young. And he said, Jeffrey, congratulations on still being the most handsome man in the world. He said you'd understand.
Well, that's very kind, Tim. Thank you so much.
He also told me to pass on his contact details to you because he'd like to meet up sometime.
Oh, I would love to be back in contact with him. So we'll do that off camera. Yeah. That sounds great.
Yeah, I'll send you his deets. Well,
by the way, do you know how, forgive me for interrupting, but do you know how you were able to see Metalstorm at that Odeon theater? Do you know how that movie got to that theater?
I've had Charlie Band on, and he told me a story about cameras having to be refitted and all sorts of complexities.
Well, I'm talking more about how it actually got distributed to England, because a great lifelong friend came from actually making Metalstorm, which was an English gentleman named Nigel Green. And Nigel Green has a company called it's Distribution UK Ltd, something like that. Anyway, Nigel distributed all of Charlie's films in the UK. So I got to meet Nigel, I believe, while I was actually filming Metalstorm, and he also distributed the Dungeon Master, etc. So my point is, that's how it got to the UK, that film.
Yeah, his company was EFD,
Entertainment Distributors. That's right.
Yeah, Entertainment Film Distributors. And often the stuff that was packaged on video through that company was under a label called EIV, Entertainment in Video. And they all had the very similar kind of white packaging with white lines. And whenever I saw one of those on the video store, I knew it was a Charlie Band film.
Right.
So,
amazing.
That's kind of interesting. Well, I'm going to ask you a few quick fire questions that I do with all my guests before we get into the depths of your career. Can you remember the very first movie you saw on the big screen at the cinema as a kid?
100%. When I was probably 7 years old, we went to, this is in Los Angeles, the whole family went to a drive-in theater, which was very popular back in the 1960s. That's where you drove your car, and there was a box that you hooked up to your window and you'd hear the sound, and then the cinema. Do you remember Once Upon a Time in Hollywood?
Oh
That
yeah. I know.
where,
I know.
and the Brad Pitt character lived right behind an outdoor cinema.
Yeah.
Anyway, and that, by the way, that was the cinema that we went to, which was the Van Nuys Cinema, and the film was From Russia with Love.
Oh wow, what a great first movie to see on the big screen.
And I became an obsessive James Bond fan from that point forward. And what's ironic is that very same week, I believe it was that week, and this is something that is uncredited. I did not actually have a credit for this, but I was in it. My mother, which we'll get into in a minute, my mother was great friends with Alfred Hitchcock. And and so I used to go on the Universal Studio lot, where Hitchcock had his offices. And on one particular day, my mother brought me over, and Hitchcock was sitting behind his chair and decided that he wanted me to be in Marnie. So I was in the very last scene of the movie, uncredited. I'm not even sure you saw my face. I think you may have seen the back of me. But when Sean Connery and Tippi Hedren walk out of this brownstone house, there are these kids playing in the street. And I was one of those kids. And that's where I met Sean Connery. So, and that was about a week after I saw From Russia with Love. So
I've only met Roger Moore and Timothy Dalton, and my first Bond was The Spy Who Loved Me, which was
a great one.
Yeah,
I remember that one very well as well. So
yeah, absolutely amazing. Okay, right, let's push on, because this is the quick fire questions round. Haven't even got onto your career yet. What was the last film you saw on the big screen?
The last film that I saw on the big screen was forgive me, the Ryan Reynolds, Hugh Jackman film. What was it? The
Marvel thing.
The Marvel film, yeah.
Yeah.
My adult son loves those films, so I always go with him when we see those films. So that was the last. I see tons of films at home, obviously, because I stream a lot of them. But there are certain movies that I want to see on the big screen, and we decided that was one of them. So
yeah, that was the last Deadpool movie. Do you have a movie, funnily enough, in your collection at home that you watch at least once a year? You have to watch at least once a year.
Yeah.
Could name me one or two of those.
Defending Your Life.
Oh my God, with Albert Brooks. That's
Correct.
such an amazing movie. I love that film.
And the other one is Warren Beatty's Heaven Can Wait.
Yeah, I absolutely love Albert Brooks. I'm a massive fan of his. And
Me too.
I saw Defending Your Life in America, actually.
Yeah.
During one of my trips there. Do you have a television series, not one that you were involved in, that you've seen since the year 2020 that you thought, wow, this is great. I have to see all of this. I have to binge this.
I'm watching one. I just finished the second season of something that I'm obsessed with, and I was so upset they only made 6 episodes for the second season, which is on Netflix, which is called The Diplomat.
Yeah, good show.
I think it's really smart, really well done, really great writing. Acting is brilliant. Yeah, so I love that show very much. So
what about a little bit further back, sort of in early 2000s, maybe? Anything? Breaking Bad, ER, maybe that Sopranos kind of time.
Well, Breaking. I mean, I'm quite good friends with Bryan Cranston because we grew up in the acting world together. Actually, his wife is a very dear friend of mine because we acted opposite each other. And I'm a huge Bryan Cranston fan. Anything that he does, I love because I just think he's such a great actor. So I'm a great fan of that show. And that's also connected to the fact that my brother, my older brother, who's amazing, happens to work for Vince Gilligan. So, that's a little bit of nepotism there. So, but I love Breaking Bad. God, what else? Going back that far. Well, the X-Files. I was a big X-Files fan.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
all right. That's more than enough. Well, let's get into your upbringing, because my mother was a ballerina. She danced for the National Ballet and a choreographer. My father was a graphic designer, so I was never going to become an accountant. Your mother is part of she was part of a Hollywood acting dynasty, and I didn't actually realize that Anna Lee was your mum until
Yep.
I was researching this. I knew all about your career, your films, but I mean, your mother, grew up in the Hollywood sort of golden era. She started in the 30s. She was in the original black and white King Solomon's Mines. I mean, this was just mind blowing for me to
Yep.
read, and then to find out that your godfather was none other than John Ford.
Correct.
So, I mean, if you can, it's a big ask, but if you can articulate what that was like growing up in that environment, because I know you grew up in Santa Monica, so you were very much in the heart of it from the get-go with your childhood, really.
Well, I mean, I think anyone, and I'm sure there's plenty of other actors that have had somewhat similar backgrounds. When you're in it, you don't really know you're in it. It's normal to you. But I had an incredibly wonderful childhood, and my mother was an amazing woman. And, long before I was born, my mother, as you well stated, my mother had an extraordinary, she had 3 different careers. So she had a huge career in England in the 30s, long before I was around. And her first husband was an iconic English director named Robert Stevenson, who many years later directed Mary Poppins.
Yeah.
But he directed King Solomon's Mines. I mean, they were sort of like the Brad and Angelina of
the
their
day.
era.
Yeah.
And they made a bunch of movies together. And then they came out to Hollywood during the war because there was sort of an unwritten rule that when London was being bombed by the Germans, that you didn't really want to live in London, especially if you had children. And they had a daughter, my late sister, Venetia. And so they decided to get out of London, and they both had opportunities to come to Hollywood. So they decided, David O. Selznick wanted to sign Stevenson to a contract. So they decided to come out to investigate that. And they came out, and I'll try to make this story quick because I know we have a lot to cover, but it's a pretty great story. So they ended up taking the Queen Mary, which was before the Queen Elizabeth. They took the Queen Mary from Dover, I guess, to New York. And then they took what was called the Super Chief, which was a train service from New York to Hollywood. And that apparently had butler service on the train. Yeah. And they arrived and were picked up by a car and driven to the Garden of Allah Hotel in Hollywood, which was a very famous place. And they checked in, and there was a note when they checked in saying that Mr. Selznick had a car picking them up at 7 o'clock because they were going up to his house to have dinner. And my mother was like horrified. We've just been on this 10-day journey and I'm exhausted. And Stevenson, her husband, rightfully said, "You don't say no to David O. Selznick." So they got themselves together. They got in the car. The car drove them up to Holmby Hills, which is a very posh area near Beverly Hills. And they arrived at Selznick's house, and it was a very, very small dinner party for 6 guests, the Selznicks, my mother and Stevenson, and 2 other people. And the 2 other people were Clark Gable and Carol Lombard.
Oh, my God.
And after the dinner, now remember, 10 days of traveling, my mother is exhausted. They have this lengthy dinner, and then Selznick takes them into a screening room on his property. And my mother has to endure, if you get this, a 7-hour cut of Gone with the Wind. And so my mother was one of the first people to ever see Gone with the Wind. So, anyway, they ended up splitting up. And then my mother immediately went under contract at RKO, and that's where her beginning association with John Ford happened. He wanted to put her in How Green Was My Valley, and then that became a very long, great, close friendship association. I believe my mother did more films for John Ford than anyone but John Wayne. I think she did 8 of them. And then, of course, as you know, because of their long association, I when I was born a number of years later, he was my godfather. And by the way, he had a lot of godchildren. I was one of many.
Sure.
So,
did you ever get to go on a John Ford set when you were a kid?
well, I worked for him.
Right.
So when I was 7 years old, so I was 7. So when I was 5 years old, it was on a Saturday, and my mother's agent dropped by the house to visit with her to talk to her about various things. And I was off in a corner playing, and the agent noticed me and looked over at my mother and said, "Does he want to act?" And my mother looked at me and said, "Do you want to act?" And I sort of shrugged my shoulders, and I was like, okay. So all of a sudden, I'm thrown into acting. And I ended up working on a number of things. And then by the time I was 7 years old, I'm brought onto the Paramount lot, and I go visit my godfather, who's sitting behind his desk chewing on a handkerchief, which is what he did. And if you remember the Spielberg film where David Lynch plays John Ford, remember that part where Lynch, the Spielberg film about the life story of Spielberg, whatever it was called. His autobiography.
The one about the family.
Yeah, and remember, it's Spielberg's recanting the story of his life and how he became a director. Yeah, and apparently it happened that he was able to meet John Ford, and John Ford was a real gruff character. I mean, he was. And I remember going into his office, and I called him Pappy, which is what everybody called him, and or Uncle Jack, because he was Jack Ford. That's what we called him. And so he's chewing on this handkerchief, and he looks at my mother, and he says, "I want to put the kid in a movie." So that movie turned out to be Donovan's Reef, and it was an incredible part. I mean, it was a huge part. And so my mother was my dialogue coach. My mother obviously, helped me with my lines. She did everything. And my mother was meant to be on the set with me at all times, as she had been previously, because I'd already done, 3 or 4 things previously to that. And so right before I'm ready to leave for Hawaii, because the film is mostly shot in Hawaii, my mother gets a part in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. So she can't go with me. So my 2 older brothers end up being my chaperones. They're only 12 and 13 years old, but my real chaperone was John Ford. So he ended up putting us in a hotel where our hotel room was right next to his bungalow. And, he was amazing. I mean, he was the most extraordinary guy of all time. And there's many, many more stories I can go into, but maybe we should move on.
Maybe you should save that for your book, because I think you should definitely write one. Would you say that this is David Lynch playing John Ford on screen now? Would you say, as somebody who met him and grew up around him, Lynch nailed him?
Nailed him. Fantastic. Yeah.
I couldn't say when I was watching, but it felt like when I was watching Lynch, I thought, this is a guy who's really studied this character. He's putting a lot of detail in this performance, and it seemed spot on to me.
Yep.
So that kind of that's nicely covered quite a few of my early questions. That explains how you first got into acting, almost by default. So I guess, did you go through, while you were picking up parts and things, did you still do the regular high school thing and the high school prom? And Did you have that experience, or was it?
I did have the experience because I actually retired at the age of about 13. So I worked steadily from the age of 5 until I was 13. And I often tell this story. And I was probably the third most successful child actor of my generation. Number one by far was Ron Howard, of course, the great director, but also an incredibly famous and highly regarded child actor. Number two, in my estimation, was this fellow named Billy Mumy, who also worked a lot, was in Lost in Space and, quite well known. And then I was probably number 3 because I did a lot of work. I mean, I did films, I did television, and I was very fortunate. For example, which will probably be on my tombstone, is I did the very last episode ever made of The Twilight Zone. So,
the original series,
the original Rod Serling Twilight Zone. Yeah. So the episode was called The Bewitching Pool. And if you look it up, it wasn't the last episode broadcast, but it was the very last episode actually made of the series. And again, not to confuse our lovely audience, but I was born with the birth name, which was the name I used as a child actor, of Tim Stafford. And there's many, many reasons that I changed my name legally many, many years later, which is not necessarily important. But the point is, from roughly the age of 13 until the age of 19, I was really retired from acting. I wasn't even sure I was going to be an actor. And I went to school and I was very athletic and I was into sports and, and I did all the high school things and the proms and this and that, and whatever. And then when I got out of high school, I had a job briefly for about a year. And suddenly I got the itch to act again. And by that time, for various reasons that are not important, I changed my name to Jeffrey Byron. I legally changed it. And the Byron came from my late great stepfather, Robert Nathan, who was a famous novelist who, wrote over 50 pieces of literature, also connected to the movie industry because he had 5 of his novels made into movies and 2 of them were
He was very much a father figure for you growing up, I think.
Very much so. No,
yeah.
I loved him dearly. And so I was 14 when he married my mother. And within a week of living under his roof after they were married, because my other siblings were grown up by then. I was the only one that was sort of left at home. And within a week of living with him, for some reason, he nicknamed me Lord Byron. That was his nickname for me. So Lord Byron stuck up until I was 18. And then on my 18th birthday, I made this decision that I was going to change my name. And then I spoke to my mother about my first name. And as most parents do when you're having a child, you probably have several names that you're considering other than the name that you actually pick. And my mother mentioned, it was Michael and this and that and Timothy. And then she said, Jeffrey. And I said, well, where did you get Jeffrey from? And she said, well, Jeffrey Hunter is a great friend of mine. Jeffrey Hunter, the actor.
Yeah.
So I was kind of trying to figure it out. And my mother said, well, I'm going to a numerologist tonight. Let me throw these names out to a numerologist. So she did. And the numerologist apparently decided that Jeffrey Byron was the name. So I legally changed my name. And this all served me, in my view, served me very well, because maybe not as much today, but back in that era, there really was a stigma of going from a child actor to an adult actor. You weren't necessarily taken seriously. Yeah. So the good news is that most people didn't make the connection between Tim Stafford and Jeffrey Byron. So I had kind of a brand new career. And then I was off and running. So
is that you in this picture in the red T-shirt?
Yeah.
Donovan's Reef. I thought so.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean,
Me.
pretty incredible set to be on as a first acting gig, because you're on set with John Wayne and Lee Marvin.
Lee
I mean,
Marvin and Dorothy Lamour and Jack
Yeah.
Warden, by the way.
yeah,
Jack Warden, who was an incredible actor. No, I got to work with some amazing people. So, yep, they're me. That's me at the very end on the right.
I mean, God, man, next we got to go down the pub sometime to talk about all these stories all night. All right, but let's get into your career as an adult, because at some point you came on Charlie Band's radar, for better or worse, as Tim Thomason might put it. And he had hilarious stories about Charlie. But by the time you did that, you had done a fair few things on television.
Oh, I've done a lot. I mean, so my adult career really began with Peter Bogdanovich. So Peter Bogdanovich, as many people within the business know, was an enormous fan of John Ford's and idolized John Ford. In fact, when Peter became a hugely successful director and had a lot of money, he bought a house across the street from John Ford.
Right.
And he used to come over on Sundays when all the godchildren came over. And that's when I first laid eyes on him. And I was a huge fan of The Last Picture Show.
Right.
And I wrote him a fan letter and told him what I loved his movies. And I just thought he was such an interesting fellow, et cetera, et cetera. And he actually replied to my fan letter and invited me to lunch on the lot at Warner Brothers. And he then told me, I've got this very small part in At Long Last Love. It's a bellhop. Would you be interested in doing it? And I said, absolutely. And I think I had one line. And I did that when I was maybe 18 years old. And then about 6 months later, he was starting a film called Nickelodeon. And he very kindly offered me a much better part in Nickelodeon. I didn't have a lot of dialogue in that movie, but I was on screen quite a bit. And Peter was a really amazing guy. Like, I had a 2-week contract on Nickelodeon. And by the time I was done with the movie, I was on it for 6 weeks because he just kept giving me more and more to do. And he became a very dear, dear friend.
He's still going. He's still around. He's still going.
No. He passed away about 2 years ago. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
God, that's right.
Yeah. So, but anyway, he really got me going. And then that led to a series of events. And then my big break, I guess one could say my big break, was a Brian Forbes film called International Velvet. So I was 21 and I was the fourth lead, which was Anthony Hopkins, Christopher Plummer, Tatum O'Neal, who was a huge star then, Nanette Newman, Brian Forbes' wife, who was quite a well-known actress, and me. And I gave Tatum O'Neal her very first on-screen kiss, which probably doesn't sound like a big deal now, but it was a pretty big deal then. So, and that put me on the map. The movie was not a successful film, but there was a lot of, before the movie came out, there was so much discussion about the film, and that jumped. And then that, by the way, led me to a really wonderful part that I adored doing, which I shot all in England, by the way. Disney hired me to be, wanted
London Connection.
Correct.
Yeah.
So I was in a dream part. I was playing like a young James Bond.
Yeah.
So, and oh, by the way, got to work with all these incredibly famous English actors, Roy Kinnear and Nigel Davenport and, all these legends, right? And oh, by the way, directed by Robert Klaus, who directed Enter the Dragon. So, so I got to work with amazing people. That was supposed to be a series of films. Unfortunately, it only ended up being one. But that, those were the things that got me going. And then I jumped into television, did quite a bit of television. I was always in the mix for the leads in television series. And the interesting story about Metalstorm, which we'll get to in a second, is I was this close, I don't know if people can see, to getting one of the leads in the biggest television series of that era, which was called Dynasty.
Yeah.
So I screen tested for Dynasty. They saw over 1,000 actors for the part, and they narrowed it down to 4, and then they narrowed it down to 2, and I was one of the 2. And then they took 6 or 8 weeks to decide between the 2 of us. And then they ended up going with the other fellow, a guy named Jack Coleman. So I was devastated because when you go through that process and it takes so long, and anytime the telephone rings, you jump. So when I found out that I hadn't gotten that part, I was really in the doldrums. And then about 6 weeks later, the phone rang, and I got an audition for this movie called Metalstorm. So, and I was brought in by this, very famous casting director named Joanna Ray, who cast all of David Lynch's films.
Yeah.
Joanna is a Brit, by the way.
Yeah,
Joanna also babysat for me when I was a little boy. And so I knew her my entire life. And I go to this office structure in Hollywood. I know nothing about Charlie Band or Albert Band, his father. I know nothing. They had a company called Empire Pictures. So I go in and I meet them all, and they're all very nice. I was the very first actor they had seen for this project. Of all the roles, I was like number 1, walked in the door. So they had 2 scenes for me to read. And that same week, I was in a very prominent acting class. The teacher was a fellow named Milton Katselis. He was the number 1 teacher. And my class, we had people like Tom Selleck, Michelle Pfeiffer, Doris Roberts, James Cromwell, all these great actors.
Right.
And Milton was giving a lecture, and he was talking about auditions, and he said, if you go in and let's say you have 2 auditions, 2 scenes to read, and if you really nail the first one, if you really feel like you've sincerely, authentically nailed it, he said, I'm going to give you a piece of advice. He said, look up at the people in the room and say, do you really need to see anything else? So I did that. I did my very first scene, and they were all like, oh yeah, that's really good. And I said, do you really need to see the second scene? And they all looked around like, what the heck is this guy saying? And then they went, well, no, we don't. So I said, well, thank you. And I left. So I'm driving home because this is before cell phones, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And I drive home. I'm wondering, I wonder how that really went. I mean, I felt like it went really well. Anyway, long story short, I get home. I'm not home for more than 5 minutes. And my agent calls me and says, they've hired you. You got the part. So they never saw another actor for that role.
Before you continue, would you give that same advice to an actor in that situation now? Because I work as an acting coach, and the advice I've always given them is, if you do a great first scene and they want you to do something else, I always say to them, take as many risks with the second choice as you can. Give them something completely different so they can see your range.
It's a very sound question. I think the most important thing about answering that question is you have to read the room.
The room, yeah.
You have to know, you don't do it to be arrogant at all.
Yeah.
You do it because what you're really saying to them is, I nailed this. I know this part. I can do it 10 more times for you, but I know that I can play this part. I feel extremely confident that I can play this part. Right. Again, not with arrogance, but with confidence. And so, but I think, like you always, the most important thing is you have to read the room. That's it. But
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and I don't. By the way, I don't remember if I don't think I ever did that again, frankly. But it worked that time.
Yeah,
So
well, which was an important time. Before, I've got some questions about Metalstorm. I want to go back to the London connection briefly,
yeah,
because I saw it at the cinema.
great,
And in fact, until I was prepping for this, I'd forgotten I'd seen it at the cinema, and it was re-released as a double bill with Aristocrats in
right,
the UK, which I honestly didn't care about seeing. I'd already seen Aristocrats when I was really small.
right,
The London connection was heavily trailered on British television, and they kept showing this amazing boat chase
right.
all around the London docks. And I always wanted to ask you, to what degree did you get to take part driving the boat and being involved in all that? And to what degree was it body doubles and stunt doubles and all the rest of it? Did you just do a couple of close-ups and then you were done, or?
Nope, I did about 90% of it. The only thing that I didn't do was dive off the ship. I didn't do that because I wanted to do it. They just didn't let me. But I did all my own fight scenes. I did, I worked very closely with the stunt men who were marvelous. But I was a very physical actor and athletic, and I enjoyed all that. That was the reason I loved doing that part, because just like the reason I love doing Metalstorm, because I got to do Metalstorm. I did everything. I mean, Metalstorm didn't have a budget for a stunt double, so they had stunt people on the set, but we did all. I mean, I had that big sword fight scene with Richard Mull, and really got hit on several occasions, by the way. Accidentally, of course, but I did all of that myself. It was obviously choreographed, but no, I did pretty much everything. Fight scenes. I rode the motorcycle. I drove the Morgan. I pretty much did all that stuff. So
also on this film, you got to work with the late great David Batley, I believe, who was in Krull. He was the magician in the fantasy movie Krull that came out.
Oh yeah, of course.
And he's the guy in the Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory who's
sure
doing he's
you're talking about the London connection.
Yeah, he was in the London.
Yeah. I mean, well, my God, if you go through that cast list, I mean, there are some extraordinary, very famous English character actors. Obviously, the most famous probably was oh God, I just blanked out. The one that always played the sort of funny characters, and his son is an incredible actor.
Oh yeah, Roy Kinnear.
Roy Kinnear, and his son is
Rory Kinnear.
Rory, who's in the Bond films, and by the way, plays the Prime Minister in The Diplomat. And
you got to work with Percy Herbert as well, who is another sort of classic British character actor. Don Fellows.
And Mona Washbourne, I believe, was in it, who was quite famous of that era. And Nigel Davenport was.
Nigel Davenport.
No, they were amazing. I mean, come on. I was so. The other guy, the guy that was in it, was English actor, but was the villain in the Bond films.
Walter Gottel.
Yeah.
Walter Gottel, yeah.
Yeah.
He played the Russian sort of guy in
The Spy Who Loved Me, and I think several Bond films. So
yeah, he was. I think the first film he was in was From Russia with Love. He was like
right. I remember he played the head of Spectre, or he played one of the guys. From Spectre.
One of their main henchmen.
Yeah. And the very first scene I remember when Robert Shaw is killing what we think is James Bond, but is actually an imposter. So no, I remember it well. So
let's talk about Metalstorm. I talked to Charlie Band about this film quite extensively, and although it is a kind of it's B movie, high western at the end of the universe, or high noon at the end of the universe, I think was the log line for the poster. I really loved this film. I really liked the music. I thought that they created a world that I kind of believed this was a world somewhere at the end of the galaxy, even though some of the effects dated really badly. And I really loved the chemistry between you and Thomason. I thought you made a really good pairing. This was the film that made me start following Tim's career. And it was also the film that made me start following your career.
Mm.
And then Kelly Preston, God rest her soul, I still can't believe she's gone.
Yeah.
I think this was almost her acting debut, I think.
Yep.
And yeah, I mean, there was a lot of kind of low budget Mad Max type rip-offs around this time. We had a ton of stuff that came out from Italy. This is probably the only one of that ilk that I got to see on the big screen. And there's just a lot that I really like about it. I really like the slow motion. It probably could have done with a bit more plot and a couple more dialogue scenes, but on the whole, that's just Charlie Bands being stingy, you know. But on the whole, I really liked it. I do like Michael Preston as a villain. I think he's a great villain.
Yep.
Well, you know, your experience of this would have been the first time you would have worked with Tim. Were you just thrown together? Did you get to do any prep or hang out before you filmed at all?
Well, Tim and I very quickly became very good friends. And we did have an incredible chemistry together, and it was instant. I mean, we just from the and we didn't read together in the audition process. They had already hired me first. Yeah. They probably hired Tim soon after, but from the moment we were on the set, and there was no prep on a movie like this because the movie was such a low budget movie that, you know, you showed up and you did your work. But we just had an instant chemistry. That was it. And if there was ever an outtake reel, it would be brilliant because we laughed so much. You know, Tim, of course, is an incredibly funny guy, but I actually had the ability to make him laugh. I could make him laugh like that. So we just, you know, like poor Charlie, because again, time is money, but we probably messed up so many takes because we would break the crew up. We would just, you know, everything. But anyway, we had a great chemistry together. He was a blast. I adored him. Making that movie was one of the great experiences of my life because it was joyful. It was everybody. The crew was incredible. You know,
how was Kelly Preston on
Kelly was lovely. I mean, Kelly was so young and so adorable and so sweet. And I knew Kelly. I got to know Kelly much better after the movie, and because I knew John, you know, years later, actually before Metalstorm, John Travolta and I had the same manager, so I knew John really well. I went to the premiere of Grease with John. I mean, with John and an entourage of people. Right. We all arrived at John's condo in West Hollywood, and we all jumped into limousines, and we all drove to the Grauman's Chinese Theater, and we were all, you know, so I knew John really well. So when John a few years later married Kelly, then I would know that I saw them socially and got to know Kelly much better. And Kelly, you know, was obviously quite young and green on Metalstorm, but, you know, ended up becoming a very good, accomplished actress. Yeah. But Tim was great. The crew was great. Charlie was amazing. You know, what a character. Yeah. Another person that should get a lot of credit for Metalstorm was Mac Allberg, the cinematographer. Right. Because even though you were 100% right that there was a lot of endless driving scenes and lack of dialogue. Yeah. The cinematography was so good. I mean, it had such a great look to the film. And that's what, did Charlie tell you how the movie was sold, by the way?
Yeah, he did. He went into the story about that in fact in some detail.
He brought me, so right in the middle of production, we shut down completely. And he said, well, we're shutting down because I've got to go to the Cannes Film Festival. And oh, by the way, you're going with me.
Yeah, to
And
pre-sell the film.
yeah,
wasn't it?
so what he didn't mention was that they had run out of money.
Right.
So he goes to Cannes, and what Charlie is absolutely brilliant at, I don't think there's anybody better at it. He's such a great marketer. He's great with artwork and posters, and he'll spend $5,000 on a poster, and that will recoup him $200,000 or $300,000 because he just is a salesman. He made this incredible 10-minute reel and then walked me around on a collar practically like I was the new, leading man dude or whatever. And which, by the way, I was thrilled to do. I'd never been to Cannes. I had an incredible time. I mean, this was like, it was eye-opening and wondrous and amazing. And I was very grateful that, he brought me. Anyway, that's when Universal was about to release Jaws 3D, which they knew was a disaster. And back in that era, all those 3D movies had to be distributed on what was called a silver screen. They had to put up a special screen. So in the States, that movie, Jaws 3D, was coming out on, I believe, 1,500 screens. Well, Metalstorm was probably never going to come out in the theaters. It was probably going to be a straight-to-video movie. But because Charlie was such a masterful salesman, he got Universal to buy Metalstorm for $5 million, which was a lot of money back then. And so Metalstorm was released on 1,500 screens right behind Jaws 3D because they knew Jaws 3D wasn't going to last in the theaters more than a week, and it didn't. Right. So, and I remember one of my great moments as an actor going back to Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Do you remember that moment where Margot Robbie is in the theater watching herself on the screen, and then the audience, and then she has a scene and the audience is kind of cheering and she's like feeling such gratification. So I go to the opening night of Jaws 3D because I know they're going to play a trailer of Metalstorm. Right. And the trailer comes up, and the moment my character comes on the screen, there is this loud scream, like, ah! And I was like in heaven. I was like, oh my God, this is so great. So, every actor wants that moment. And that was my one little moment that I had. So anyway, the movie ended up making $25 million, which again, it cost probably $300,000 to make. So it was a bona fide huge success. So there you have it.
Did you go? I will ask a Richard Mole question before we move on, but did you go straight from Metalstorm to Ragewar? Because it literally, a lot of the stuff in Ragewar is let's get the same props and cars and things that we've got available and shoot. I felt like that movie was partly written around the resources that.
Well, if you would consider this straightforward, we wrapped Metalstorm on a Friday night and we were shooting Ragewar on a Saturday morning. So yes,
I knew it was something like that.
So about halfway through production, Charlie, I guess, decided I was a good guy to work with and he wanted to work with me again. So he offered me Ragewar, which then ended up becoming the Dungeon Master, and we were casting it simultaneously while we were finishing Metalstorm, and and that dream sequence at the very beginning of Ragewar was the very first thing we ever shot. So and that was literally shot. I'm not kidding you. We wrapped Metalstorm like at 2:00 in the morning on a Friday. And I was on that set less than 5 hours later in, I believe, Long Beach, California. So
before we move on, I want to ask you a couple of quick questions about the actors that played the villains, right? Because you pull off this guy's arm, which is a great sequence in the movie. I absolutely love that sequence. This actor is R. David Smith, who plays Bao. sort of, he didn't do a huge number of things. 12 credits on IMDb, a couple of stunt credits. Was he essentially a stuntman, doing an acting
Yeah,
bit? Yeah, is that fair?
I think he was more a stuntman than an actor. Yeah. So
I loved him. I mean, it's like he had practically no lines, but the costume, and it really worked.
No, great. And by the way, the Kathy Griffin, was it? The costume person was amazing. She did. Hold on, I'm sorry, I'm not being rude. I'm just looking up the costume design. Kathy Clark. Kathy Clark, who dressed me all in black leather, and I think her. And remember, working on a tiny little budget, I think she did a great, because I think my character's look was very dramatic and very kind of cool. She did a great job, I thought. So, and by the way, that scene where I rip his arm off and I throw his arm directly into the camera was done in one take.
Yeah, I kind of figured that was probably the case.
Yeah. So,
you got to work with Richard Mole, who is in another favorite film of mine, which is The Sword and the Sorcerer. And, there were a lot of these kind of almost indie, made for under $1 million movies coming out around that time, particularly in the fantasy and sci-fi genre. And believe me, I devoured the lot. And that was how eventually I came into contact with him. He would later become a mentor of mine, Albert Poon. It was just brilliant director. He could make something from nothing pretty much, and had to quite a lot of the time. Richard Mole was one of his go-to collaborators, who sadly, I think he passed away last year.
You did, yeah.
How did you find working with him? Because he's a tall, intimidating guy. He's 6'6" or something like that, I think.
Well, I obviously worked with him on 2 films in a row. He was a pro, very much to himself, kind of quiet, but a total pro. And man, once the camera was on, he was on, and he was really, I enjoyed working with him. I mean, he was, and he obviously had a huge career on Night Court, which was quite a famous television series. And the reason that character on Night Court was bald was because he had shaven his head for Metalstorm, and he had actually begged them not to shave his head.
Right.
He was up for this big audition, but they ended up, I guess, paying him a little bit more money to shave his head. So he assumed that he probably would lose this part on Night Court. And of course, not only did he get the part, he had to continue to shave his head for the rest of the series because they loved that character being bald. So, but no, he was a serious man, but very nice and a real pro, and clearly a classically trained actor. He had a great voice.
Yeah, incredible. I would love to have seen him on stage.
Yeah.
In the 90s, you did a fair number of guest spots on TV, but you did some big recurring roles, both on The Bold and the Beautiful and Port Charles, which was kind of a massive show back then. Most people in the UK probably wouldn't know it, but it's well known for launching the career of a number of actors. So was that a conscious choice to do a long-running show just to have some work coming in to stop you being restless? Or because I don't think you probably weren't, you were probably fortunate in the sense that you didn't have to work for food, if I'm fair to put it like that. You didn't have to take every job that got offered your way because you'd already had a career as a kid. You would have had some foundations, I imagine.
Well, I mean, look, acting, if you're an actor and if in my case, fortunate to be a working actor, and any actor is fortunate to be a working actor.
Sure.
I'm of the great belief that you take the jobs that you get. I mean, unless there's just something repulsive about the job, you want to work. And so, and sometimes the opportunities that you want aren't presented to yourself. So you move on and you take the next opportunity. And so I, somewhere in my 30s, this was after Metalstorm, I was being offered opportunities to be in soap operas. And in soap operas at that time, there had been a stigma about being on soap operas previous to that period, but soap operas became, in the States, had become incredibly popular. My mother had a second career as a very famous soap opera character.
Yeah, that's right.
Probably more fame from that role than 100 acting movies that she had done. So somewhere in my early 30s, they kept knocking on my door, and I said no a few times. And then finally an opportunity came up, and I had a long chat with my agent about it. And he said, well, you could go and do this for a couple of years and bank some money and then leave and then go back and resume whatever else you want to do. So there was an opportunity on a show in New York called One Life to Live. And so it wasn't a bona fide offer, but it was an offer depending on whether the screen test went well, because they wanted to see if I had chemistry with the actress. So I flew to New York and did the screen test, and we had chemistry, and they hired me. And I lived in New York for a period of time and did that show, and then that role ended, and then I got another part on another quite famous American soap opera called All My Children.
Yeah.
Also done in New York, which was a great experience in my life because I had never lived in New York. So for almost 2 years, I lived in New York, and that was an exciting time to be in New York. It was in the mid to late 80s, and it was it was great. I really enjoyed that time. And then I came back to LA, and then eventually, once you're on soaps, you get a reputation, because soaps are not easy to do. You know, actors that are on soaps really have to be on their P's and Q's. You have lots of dialogue to memorize, and you're doing it in one day. You're shooting an entire episode in a day. It's quite daunting. So once your brain figures that out, then you become somewhat of a commodity. And then I got hired. I did that reoccurring role on The Bold and the Beautiful. And then eventually they offered me a role on Port Charles, which was supposed to be a 3-month run, and I did it for 4 years. So all of it was, a good experience. And, again, I'm blessed. If I never worked again in my life as an actor, I can always say that I was a working actor, which in itself is quite an accomplishment. So
absolutely. I mean, there's not many people that can say that they've been on set with John Wayne, and Tim Thompson. So
correct.
I'm ribbing Tim about that, because I know he's going to watch this.
Good.
Is there a period at all, because it was impossible for me to find this out on Google, where you did a period of stage work? Did you do some stage work in New York, perhaps, while you were there? Any plays?
No, I didn't. I did. I mean, I've done a number of plays in Los Angeles, but that was probably very early, on in my career.
It's not a massive theater town, is it?
No, not really. But I mean, it exists. It's just not. Sure. This is what we call little theater. It's usually housing 100 seats or less.
Yeah.
So, but I probably did 3 or 4 plays, and I enjoy the theater. The theater is great. But there's also a huge commitment to the theater, in the sense that there's so much prep work going into a play, and I was frankly more looking to get work and frankly get a paycheck. So,
cool. So more recently, you've worked on this show called The Resonator, which is also, I think, it was a movie, and there's also a mini series. Do you want to tell me a little bit about that?
Well, I got hired by a guy named Billy Butler, lovely guy, very talented writer, director. And I knew Billy socially, And Billy cornered me one day at a function, a party that I saw him at. And he told me this story that I was aghast that I didn't know. And he said, "Do you know that I worked on Metalstorm and the Dungeon Master?" And I said, "What?" And he goes, "I was a PA. I worked for Charlie. I was a PA. And then eventually Charlie gave me opportunities to act. And then eventually Charlie gave me opportunities to direct." And by the way, this is another great story about Charlie Band, that he really did give people opportunities. And that's
Yeah.
such an incredible thing. You know,
Yeah.
he really launched the careers. And Billy's really talented. So Billy told me the story about how Charlie, I guess, had made a deal with Amazon and sold a lot of his content to Amazon. And then Amazon was looking for new content. So they, I guess, came up with this idea of the resonator. And then I guess there was a part to play the lead character's father, who was dead, by the way.
Right.
So I was a ghost. But I guess he ran it by Charlie, and Charlie very graciously said, "Oh, that's great," because I hadn't, frankly, had a conversation with Charlie in 30 years. And so they put me in the resonator, and it was fun. I had a great time. We shot the first season during COVID, which was challenging. And then we did a second season in Cleveland, and that was it. I don't know. I don't think they've ever done any more that I'm aware of since then. But I did about 6 or 7 of the episodes, and no, it was great fun. I had a great time. And
have you
yeah.
ever been tempted to go down the producing, directing, writing road yourself, or are you?
Well, I'm very
you've done a bit of writing.
I'm very ensconced in the producing world right now. So going back to my late beloved stepfather, Robert Nathan, I control all the rights to his works. So I have a wonderful partner who's one of my best friends, who I've known since I was 17 years old, whose name might mean something to your audience, because she's also a very well-known actress. Her name is Colleen Camp.
Oh my God, I'm a massive fan.
So Colleen is my best friend. And
oh man, you've got to tell her hello from me, please.
So Colleen, who is a very well-known actress, but also a very formidable producer, and she's like a lightning in a bottle. She knows everybody. She has what is known through Hollywood circles as the Golden Rolodex. She literally knows everybody. She can get anybody on the phone like that. Right. She is also known within the circles as the director whisperer. She has all these incredibly great relationships with directors. And they idolize her. You know, they want her to be in the cutting room with her, because they respect her opinion. Colleen has this innate ability where she knows what doesn't work in a movie, and then she knows how to solve it or fix it. Right. She's also incredible at discovering talent. For example, she discovered Ana de Armas, who's now a huge star. So anyway, long story short, she's my partner on all the works of Robert Nathan. We have 4 different Robert Nathan novels that are in development right now. Right. 2 of them have scripts. One of them has been written by Osgood Perkins, who's incredibly hot right now because he wrote and directed Longlegs, which is a huge, I don't know if it's a hit in the UK, but it's a massive hit around the world. I don't know if you're familiar with the film, but it made $150 million, and it cost like $8 million to make. It stars Nick Cage. Sure. Anyway, so we are on the precipice of getting several things made right now, which of course is very exciting to me because Robert Nathan was my hero, and I'm incredibly passionate about his works. And just quickly going back to Robert Nathan for 1 second. So in his storied career, he had 5 of his books made into movies. 2 of them were Academy Award winning movies, meaning that he wrote the novel that was turned into the movies. The Bishop's Wife, Cary Grant, David Niven, Loretta Young. and Portrait of Jenny, which was a David O. Selznick film starring Joseph Cotton and Jennifer Jones. Between the two of them, they were nominated for 7 Academy Awards and won 2, I believe. So, so anyway, that is my life works at this time in my life. I am incredibly passionate about getting these movies made. So,
well, perhaps what we could do for you in the future is when you're further down the road with those, because the channel's called The Outcast Creator for a reason, and we're all about supporting independent, passionate, creative people, of which you are one. And
thank you.
When my channel's a bit bigger and it's growing all the time, I'd love to have you guys come back on. Please bring Miss Camp if you wish. I'll try not to be so fanboyish when she comes on. And if we can support and promote those projects in any way that would be useful to you, we're here to do that. So
Great.
Please do come back. My final question to you for today is, what do you think? Let's put this as an actor. I know you've got your finger in a few pies, but let's put this as an actor. I mean, you've had an incredible career. You've worked with incredible people, lots of different film and television productions on every scale. What would you say is the most valuable takeaway lesson that you've learned that you could pass on to an actor in their 20s now?
Resilience.
Right. Be resilient. Be tough.
I mean, acting is not a part-time profession, and you don't become an actor to become famous. The only reason an actor becomes an actor is because they realize that in their heart, that's the only thing that they were born to do. So it doesn't matter what you have to do to make a living, to become or to realize your dream. You can be a waiter. You can sweep the streets. You can clean out toilets. You can do whatever you need to do. But if you truly can't in your heart do anything else, then you're an actor. If you are a dilettante and just want to be famous, then you shouldn't be an actor. So it's not about fame. Fame might come from being an actor, but it's about the fact that you can't in your heart do anything else and be happy. This is all you want to do. And that is the life of an actor. And so you have to be resilient. You have to be able to take rejection, because you're going to be rejected 99% of the time. And you live for that 1%. And then lastly, the great thing about being an actor today, frankly, versus when I came up, is something like this.
Yeah.
You can make your own movies on an iPhone. So if you're not getting the auditions that you want, or if you're not getting the opportunities, then guess what? Write something and make something yourself and get it out there. Everybody now has a platform that they can be seen. So write it, produce it, direct it, edit it. And if you're passionate enough to get it out there, then you have opportunities. So
it's crazy to think that most people now are carrying in their hand the lenses that John Ford had to shoot his movies on. There is, as you say, there's literally, if the work's not coming to you, go out and create. There is no excuse. You can edit
100%.
And you can grade on your phone. You can do everything at home now. So find a way and make it. Jeffrey, thank you so much for coming on. I know we had to postpone this once because you had a production meeting. I'm so glad we were able to reschedule it. And we are an independent channel. I've been doing this for a couple of years. Your interview number 83 for me. I'm trying to hit 100 before New Year's Day. So thank you for making a really valuable contribution to my own creative journey as well. Your insight, your knowledge has been fantastic. And I mean, plus it's also great to hear these wonderful stories about actors that I grew up with, and giving me a bigger sense of, the likes of what Richard Mole were like, and John Ford, and so on. And these are valuable gems that, it's so great that you're putting them out there, because once they're gone, they're gone. and really do appreciate you coming and supporting my channel with this interview as well. So thank you so much for your time.
It is my sincere pleasure. And remember, off screen, you're going to give me Tim Thomerson's information so that I can harass him.
I am, absolutely. So just before we end, guys, and that means I'm going to have to put poor Jeffrey through the Outcast's end credits song. I just want to remind people that tonight I've got award-winning board games designer, historical board games designer, Dana Lombardi coming back on the channel, who's got more awards than I can shake a fist at for designing various games about things like the Battle of Stalingrad and Gettysburg and everything in between. He's just launched one of the most successful Kickstarter campaigns in history. His game was funded in 44 minutes, and it's very difficult to fund anything on Kickstarter these days. So he's going to be coming in and telling us how he did that and plugging his new game. I'm happy to have him back on, and I've got no less than 4 industry interviews next week, but I'll tell you all about those another time because I don't want to keep Jeff on any longer than necessary. So thanks to everybody in chat for watching. I know this is an earlier one than scheduled. I know a lot of people will watch it on catch up, but thank you for your comments. Jeff, thanks so much for coming in. Really do appreciate it. So I'll be back just before midnight UK time. In the meantime, everybody can listen to this.
Hang out with the lands at the Outcast Creative, where all the misfits and dreamers get innovative. It's film, TV, and theater in the mix.